digging their own graves. Sadly, the belief in authority even makes people feel obligated to assist in their own enslavement, oppression, and sometimes death. In fact, only a small percentage of the coercion of government is implemented by the enforcers of authority. Most of it is implemented by its victims. The ruling class merely tells people that they are required to do certain things, and most people comply without any actual enforcement taking place. As one impressive example, tens of millions of Americans each year fill out lengthy, confusing forms known as tax returns, essentially extorting themselves. If the victims of the IRS agreed to pay, but only if government figured out their alleged tax liabilities, the system would collapse. Every tax return is basically a signed confession, with the victim of the extortion racket not only revealing everything about his finances, essentially interrogating himself, but also even figuring out the amount he will be robbed so the thieves do not have to. But all the unproductive and unpleasant inconveniences and bureaucratic hassles that people subject themselves to, simply because they were told that the law requires it, are nothing compared to the more serious symptoms of the belief in authority. Based upon the mythology of duty to country and the laws imposing military conscription, the draft, millions of people throughout history have become murderers for the state. Only a small fraction, so called draft dodgers, ever resisted, and they have usually been despised by their fellow countrymen for being cowards or for lacking patriotism. In the case of many laws, it can be difficult to distinguish between people who obey because of a simple fear of punishment and those who obey out of a feeling of moral obligation to bow to the commands of politicians, the law. With military conscription, however, it is easy to tell the difference because compliance is usually far more dangerous than any punishment government threatens against those who refuse to comply. If the choices are to comply and possibly die a gruesome death on some battlefield on the other side of the world, or to disobey and possibly go to prison, it is unlikely that the threat alone is why so many people register and show up for duty when called. In short, the level of compliance with the draft, at least in the past, shows quite clearly that most people would rather commit murder or die than disobey authority. There could hardly be a better indication of just how powerful the superstition of authority is. That thousands upon thousands of otherwise civilized, peaceful human beings will leave home, sometimes traveling halfway around the world to kill or die, simply because their respective ruling classes told them to. Every soldier is both an enforcer and a victim of the superstition of authority, whether he volunteered or was drafted. Fighting to defend innocents against aggressors is a noble cause and is often the intention of those who join the military. But in a hierarchical military regime, the soldiers become a tool of the machine rather than a responsible individual. Rather than being guided by his own conscience, he is controlled entirely by the orders he receives through the chain of command. And every time his obedience leads to him doing something immoral, which is quite often, he not only harms his victims, he also harms himself. After the Vietnam War, as one example, many American soldiers came home with their bodies intact but deep psychological problems. How much of the mental damage was the result of witnessing carnage, and how much was the result of personally creating carnage is difficult to say. A prolonged fear of imminent death can, of course, cause serious psychological problems, as can inflicting death upon others. Violent confrontations can be quite stressful, even when the individual feels entirely justified, such as when defending his family from an attacker. But to engage in mortal combat, where no one, including the combatants, seems to have any clear idea what the purpose or justification of the conflict is, as occurred in Vietnam, seems to add an additional degree of psychological trauma. As many combat soldiers have attested to, once In the hell of war, any vague but noble cause or justification for the fight is usually forgotten, and all that is left is the desire to stay alive and to help one's friends stay alive, both of which are served much better by going home or by not joining the military in the first place. And yet, the number of people who simply walk away is quite small. For one reason, because it would constitute an act of disobedience to a perceived authority. And the average soldier, though he may have the courage and strength to throw himself into mortal combat, does not have the courage and strength to disobey a perceived authority. In many cases of authoritarian coercion, the victims of military conscription almost always far outnumber those trying to implement it. Even when the people are legally commanded to sacrifice their minds and bodies for the sake of turf wars between tyrants, simply passive disobedience by any significant portion of draftees would make the war machine grind to a halt. What punishment is there to fear that, if worse than the result of compliance? The usual results of fighting in war are prolonged terror, physical, mental pain and suffering, dismemberment, or death. Nonetheless, even after witnessing the horror of war firsthand, very few people can bring themselves to disobey authority, take off the uniform, and walk away. A testament to the power of the belief in authority is well documented, if seldom discussed, fact that the atrocities committed against German Jews by the Nazis were often carried out with the cooperation and assistance of Jewish police, such as occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto. In their culture, just as in almost every other culture, the people had been so thoroughly convinced that obedience is a virtue that even though so, someone new was in charge, they still felt obligated to do as they were told, even if it meant violently oppressing their own kinsmen. But what may be even more disturbing, but indisputable, is the fact that many millions of people in history have assisted in their own extermination because authority told them to do so. For example, during the Holocaust, many hundreds of thousands of Jews, on their own power, boarded the cattle cars of the very trains that would take them away to their deaths without trying to hide, run away, or resist. Why? Because those pretending to be authority told them to. While it was no doubt true that they were not all aware of what exactly lay in store for them at the other end, they still handed themselves into the custody of a machine that obviously meant them harm. There's a certain feeling of comfort and safety that one gets by conforming and obeying. Believing that things are in someone else's hands and having trust that someone else will make things right is a way of avoiding responsibility. Authoritarian indoctrination stresses the idea that no matter what happens, if you simply do as you are told and do what everyone else does, everything will be okay and those in charge will reward and protect you. The body counts from one government atrocity after another show how misguided such a belief truly is. Had the victims of legal oppression and murder simply withheld their assistance, even if they did not lift a finger to forcibly resist, the world would be a very different place today. If the Nazis had to physically carry each Jew, dead or alive, to the gas chamber or crematoriums, the level of murder would have been dramatically lower. If every slave into bondage had refused to work, there would soon have been no slave trade. If the IRS had to calculate the tax due and then directly take it from each taxpayer, there would be no more federal taxation. In short, the victims of authoritarian extortion, harassment, surveillance, assault, kidnapping, and murder simply stopped assisting in their own oppression, tyranny would crumble. And if the people went a step further and forcibly resisted, tyranny would collapse even more quickly. But resistance, whether passive or violent, requires the people to disobey a perceived authority, and that is something that most people are psychologically incapable of doing. Ultimately, it is the belief in authority among the victims of oppression, even more than the beliefs of the ruling class and their enforcers, which allows tyranny and man's inhumanity to man to continue on such a large scale.